Okay, and I see that Khalid has come in too. Hi, Khalid. I think we're all set up. Okay, so I think we might be ready to get started. We've got a nice number here, about almost 60 people with us. Are you ready, Nate? And you ready, Freddie?
Yeah, I am ready, Doctor.
Okay, fantastic. Um, okay.
Message, yeah.
Yes, I will start now. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Hi. Welcome to the second webinar that is being co-hosted by Harper College at Binghamton University in conjunction with Christ University in Bangalore. My name is Nancy I'm Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Inclusion here in Harper. And on behalf of the college, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which has been designed to sustain the intellectual and social links between our two campuses at a time when international travel has become very difficult. As just a few protocols, we are recording the session and we will record the presentation portion. We will cease to record or pause recording when we get to question and answers. And I hope that Khalid can remind me to do that because I think I forgot last time, but we will endeavor to do that properly this time. And I would just let you know as a few protocols, all participants are muted on our end. If you are having some kind of difficulties or something that you'd like to mention to us, you can chat to the panelists only. We will be using the question and answer function for questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll just ask that you hold the questions until that time. And before turning to our speaker for this webinar, I would first like to introduce Freddie Majuru, who is a research scholar of international studies from the Department of International Relations, Political Science, and History at Christ. And Freddie has kindly agreed to say a few words of welcome on behalf of our partner institutions. So I'll turn it over to you, Freddie. Okay, and I think I need to unmute you, Freddie, so there we go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nancy. Yes, indeed, I'm Freddie Majuru, a research scholar in the Department of International Studies, Political Sciences and History at Christ University here in Bangalore. I do not want to say much, but today's talk has reminded me one thing, that history is omnipresent. Whether it is correct or whether it is not correctly spoken or written, it is omnipresent because it helps to nurture, it helps to formulate narratives, analogies, even all the frameworks in public policies, relationships, even collective memory. Therefore, it is upon us to try and understand history because it formulates who we become in the next day or in the next years to come. And today's topic is a more sensitive one, a critical one, of slavery and racism, more so in the Indian Ocean. These are countries maybe such as Pakistan, Iran, India, maybe in Sri Lanka. Therefore, let us all come and let us analyze, let us look and try to shape our own narratives and try maybe to be relevant in our own time. I'm going to give it over to you, Dr. Nancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Freddie. It's been so wonderful to work with you and to collaborate with you. And I'm looking forward to just continuing these conversations that we've been able to sustain over the past few weeks. And I really want to thank you for bringing such a robust audience from your campus. We had our first webinar with Christ last week and started a terrific conversation. I will say for my part, I was tremendously impressed with your students at Christ who brought a level of engagement and enthusiasm to the event that really was quite impressive for us here at Binghamton. So thank you very much. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this event. Nathaniel Mathews is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Binghamton University. He earned his BA at Howard University and then his MA at Georgetown and his PhD at Northwestern, with a concentration in history and a particular focus on East Africa and the Indian Ocean. In particular, Professor Mathews looks at the salient connections that have been sustained between the Swahili coast and the Arabian Peninsula, while considering the important and formative roles that Islam, Arab and African identities, the institution of slavery, and political movements have played in shaping the connected histories of the wider region of the Western Indian Ocean. He has published widely on these topics and is currently at work on a book called Children of the Lost Colony. Today, he has kindly agreed to deliver a lecture entitled Slavery and Anti-Black Racism in the Modern Indian Ocean. Thank you so much, Professor Mathews, for agreeing to give this lecture. And I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. and thank you, Freddie, for that timely framing. Thank you all for being here, for taking the time out of your busy schedules, your days to listen to this lecture. I'm going to be relatively brief, I think. I'm going to try to stay within 30 to 35 minutes. And then I want to hear from you all because this topic is vast. It is full of pitfalls, right? Places where we can misunderstand or where our definitional premises are not adequate to the social phenomenon that we're trying to understand. So we're going to be talking about slavery and anti-Black racism in the modern Indian Ocean. And I'll just say that the way that I come to this topic is as first and foremost is as my positionality as a white American navigating and trying to understand race in the United States. Now, you as South Asian students may have been reading the news that's been coming out from the United States. You've been seeing perhaps the protests that have emerged around the killing of George Floyd by the police in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or the killing of Breonna Taylor by the police. And so I'm coming from a background where I'm interested in the history of anti-Black racism in the United States. Now, I also happen to be married to a South Asian, and who is from Delhi, and we have a lot of conversations about the similarities between American and Indian society and the similarities and differences between race and caste. And so this is something that I'm very curious to explore more with you. But by way of framing the topic, I'll just offer some historical definitions and some arguments and assertions that I'm making. And then we will take questions, I hope. Right, now, let's see if I can. Okay. So we're talking about the Indian Ocean world, a vast, vast area. So any generalizations that we make about slavery and anti-Black racism have to be also put alongside specific histories because race and social identity vary across this vast region. We are talking about a region that has been central to the global economy since antiquity, a region where Asians, Africans, Arabs, Indonesians, and others have been crossing the seas to trade and also intermarry. We are talking about an ocean that is the world's third largest, that takes up 14% of the globe, and that is 1/5 of the world's total oceanic area. It's often been called the cradle of globalization because of the unique monsoon wind patterns that enable humans to sail across it and engage in trade. And the interesting thing about navigation across the sea is that it has distinct kinds of advantages to moving across land. It takes the same energy to move 250 kilograms by wheel that it does to move 2,500 kilograms by railway, that it does to move 25,000 kilograms by water. A dhow, an Indian Ocean dhow, a sailing vessel, could travel the same distance as a camel caravan in 1/3 of the time, and each boat could carry the equivalent of 1,000 camel loads. Now, one of the commodities shipped across the Indian Ocean was the human commodity. Enslaved people. We often associate, and this will be part of the talk later, but we often associate the slave trade and slavery with Africans, but in fact, every ethnicity has been enslaved at one time or another in the Indian Ocean. And for most of the ocean's history, there was no dominant ethnic group or region where slaves came from. But we will see that begins to change in the late 18th and 19th century. What are we talking about when we talk about slavery? A vast world historical phenomenon. There are some definitions that come from sociologists and historians. One in particular that I like comes from Orlando Patterson, who defines slavery as a distinct form of extreme domination. And Patterson points out the phenomenon that he calls natal alienation. Natal alienation, that is the essence of making someone into a slave, is to rip them from kin and family and and home. Because if you don't do that, then their family is going to what? Try to redeem them, try to get them back. So one distinctive aspect of slavery is natal alienation. Slaves are also generally considered dishonored persons, Patterson found in his global study of slavery. That is, slaves are found at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and there is certain kinds of disrespect that can be shown to them that can't be shown to other people. Moses Finley, a classicist and historian, has also contributed to understanding of slavery in the Anglophone world, and calls slavery a species of dependent labor. That is, there are many kinds of dependent labor. Slavery is a particular kind of dependent labor, and it is based on a property relation. To one degree or another, slaves are owned. So there is a chattel relation that is fundamental to the slave relation. Now, if we look at the history of slavery in the Indian Ocean world, we find that despite the fact of this property relation, slaves also have a legal personality and they have legal rights. For example, if you study the history and evolution of Islamic law in the Indian Ocean, you'll find that slaves had well-defined rights to marry, that the offspring of a free man and an enslaved woman was legally free. Okay, so slaves are often caught in this ambiguity between being someone's property, but also having legal rights and being considered a human being. The topic of Indian Ocean slavery from East Africa is a vast one. I teach a whole course on the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean, and we look at the different regions of East Africa where slavery or where slaves were sourced from. Some generalizations that we can make about this trade: it's of a relatively small scale for most of its history. Enslaved people are often enslaved because of a debt. This is probably the most common way that slaves are made in the Indian Ocean, is because of a debt that is owed and needs to be paid, and then the person who holds that debt can either sell that person, or if they're unable to pay, or sometimes what they do is they pawn that the person who is the debtor pawns themselves or one of their family members in a kind of temporary servitude to the person holding the debt. Sometimes this method is called pawning. This is a way to work off your debt by working for someone else. This is a trade dating back to antiquity. It's very old. And as I mentioned, enslaved people can come from many different ethnic groups. Another distinct feature of Indian Ocean slavery is routes to manumission. Routes to manumission. That is, the period of you being a slave is a finite one. There is an end to it. You can imagine a future where not only you might be free, but where your offspring might be free. And this is in contrast, it must be said, to the transatlantic slave trade, where manumission was much more infrequent. Slavery was a lifetime condition, and slavery was a generational condition. And the other thing that's very important and distinct about Indian Ocean slavery, and I'll speak here more specifically about the trade between East Africa and India, especially in the 14th through the 16th centuries, is that slaves are often very close to elite groups in society in the places they are brought to. Why are enslaved people so valuable to society's elites? Well, let's take the example of central India in the Deccan. And here you see a picture of the Sultan of Bijapur with Ikhlas Khan, an Abyssinian nobleman who was also regent of the kingdom for many years. And Ikhlas Khan was not alone in Bijapur. He was actually one of thousands of Abyssinians, who were often called Habashis, who served the sultans of the Deccan. And they were particularly valuable to the rulers because of the fact of them being natally alienated from existing kin networks and being totally dependent on the ruler. The ruler could count on their loyalty as long as they were well treated, Oftentimes he could count on their loyalty more than he could count on the loyalty of his extended kin networks. So enslaved Africans, primarily from Ethiopia, many of them from the Oromo ethnic group, served in the sultanates of the Deccan. One of the most famous of these is Malik Ambar, who organized resistance to the Mughals as they are coming south into the Deccan, attempting to invade. Malik Ambar, an Oromo from East Africa, from Ethiopia, finds his way via Baghdad to India, is trained by other Abyssinians as a warrior, and comes to a place where he essentially holds political power because of the effectiveness of his resistance against outsiders. And so coming back to the main point, this proximity to elites marks this kind of slavery as much different from both transatlantic slavery of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, but also of the kinds of slavery that would occur later in the Indian Ocean world in the 19th century. Okay. Let's go to the next slide. And now I want to talk about race. I think that there is a broad misconception that race is something that has nothing to do with India, that is really an American preoccupation. And certainly the Americas, in not just the United States, but also Central and South America, have been tremendously shaped by the idea of race and by racism. So what I want to do, though, is to try to step back and examine the idea of race from a more sociological perspective, to try to understand what are the constituent elements of race, and what is it? What are we talking about when we talk about race? Okay. First and foremost, race is a way of classifying human bodies. And typically it is a way of classifying those bodies into a hierarchy, a ranked hierarchy. And there is an element of irrationality and superstition to all ways of classifying human bodies. And this is why the sociologists Barbara and Karen Fields call the obsession with race in the Americas racecraft. You have heard perhaps of witchcraft, a form of irrational belief in the connections between the seen world and the unseen world. Well, racecraft, say the Fields sisters, functions in a similar way. It makes an irrational connection between someone's physical appearance and their character or the threat that they might represent. Okay? So in this way, we can see that race is not necessarily a black thing, right? It is not something that operates only on black bodies. It is something that actually in American history has operated to exclude Asians. It has operated, it operates now to marginalize and racialize Muslims in United States society. And it also works, there is a specific kind of racism that I'm calling anti-Black racism that targets Black bodies, okay? You may have heard this phrase, race is a social construction. And that is true, although it is often left there and we don't elaborate what it means that race is a social construction. Race has very real effects, even though it is not biologically real. And the process of becoming racialized is something that Omi and Winant in 1986 called racial formation. They coined this term, racial formation, to describe how people undergo processes of racialization and become, and even come to think of themselves as a particular race. And Omi and Winant also use this word racial common sense, right? It's like, how do we know that someone is of a particular race? It's because of the social messages that we receive. It's because of the way that we've put together their physical appearance with some kind of ideal type that we already have. And we combine that with prejudice and we get various kinds of racial common sense. And racial common sense is very dangerous. And I'll just, again, point to the United States example. It is very dangerous because once racial common sense solidifies around a particular group, it makes that group uniquely vulnerable to violence, to marginalization, and to various kinds of irrational prejudices, okay? And so what we're trying to, the question that we're trying to answer, or I'm trying to answer in this presentation, why and how does a link solidify between racial Blackness and slaveness in the Indian Ocean world? And so that's the question I'm gonna try to answer, a question that I would like you guys to think about. I've offered some definitions for thinking about race and racial formation. And I want you guys to think about and answer, maybe in discussion, some of the similarities and differences between race and caste formation, okay? One thing that I can think of right offhand is the idea of purity, the idea of certain kinds of raced and casted bodies are considered impure on some basic level. And that affects social relations on many levels. So we're talking about Indian Ocean slavery. A significant transformation in the institution occurs in what's called the long 19th century. And the reason I call it the long 19th century is because the processes that shape the character of Indian Ocean slavery don't begin in 1800. They actually begin towards the end of the 18th century. And they began really in the islands of Mauritius and Reunion, where French planters use imported African slave labor to grow sugar. Sugar was the major commodity crop produced by slave labor in the Americas. It was originally produced by slave labor in the Mediterranean and in Mediterranean islands. Then it was produced in Brazil, in parts of the southern United States, and especially in the modern Caribbean. And in fact, this is an interesting, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but if we look at connections between India and Africa, we see that Indian indentured labor in the Caribbean is also involved in sugar production. And so the distinctive aspect of Indian Ocean slavery in the long 19th century is the use of slave labor to generate capital, the slave as an instrument of productive labor. Whereas before, slaves may have been useful in military capacities, as domestic servants, as eunuchs in royal courts. In the 19th century, slave labor becomes extremely important for producing commodities that can be sold in global markets. So things like pearls. Pearl diving in the Gulf is done with slave labor. On the east coast of Africa, on the islands of Zanzibar and Pemba, cloves are cultivated using slave labor. On the nearby coast, the Swahili coast of East Africa, grain is cultivated using slave labor. And this is all happening in the Indian Ocean world over the course of the 19th century. These relations are intensifying. At the same time as European powers, especially the British Empire, are abolishing the slave trade and slavery in the Atlantic world. Now, one of the unintended effects of abolition in the Atlantic world was to lower the price of slave labor so that regimes and states in the Indian Ocean world began to see the advantages of using slave labor to generate profits for themselves. And so the hinterlands of East Africa are hyper exploited. Debt relations that exist are exploited, and hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans are shipped to destinations around the Indian Ocean world, including not only Mauritius and Reunion, but southern Iran, parts of the Persian Gulf, Oman, Yemen, as well as to the coast of East Africa. And so we see that emerging forms of mercantile capitalism in the Indian Ocean rely on Indian Ocean slave labor. And this it reminds me of the former Prime Minister of Trinidad, Eric Williams, Dr. Eric Williams, who also attended my alma mater of Howard University, wrote a classic book called Capitalism and Slavery, in which he overturned a lot of the traditional thinking about the character of slavery and the character of abolition. And one of the perennial questions in the history of slavery is what came first, racism or slavery? Now, Williams has a particular answer to this. He says, slavery in the Caribbean has been too narrowly identified with the Negro. A racial twist has thereby been given to what is basically an economic phenomenon. Slavery was not born of racism, rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. unfree labor in the New World was brown, white, black, and yellow, Catholic, Protestant, and pagan. So what is Eric Williams saying here, and what does it have to do with Indian Ocean slavery? The particular relationship between slavery and racism, slavery and anti-Black racism, is forged in the Atlantic world. And it is forged not because, and this is Williams' argument, not because of the preponderance of prejudiced attitudes towards Africans, which already existed. Williams acknowledges that they existed, but it exists because of the profit motive. In other words, there is an economic motive to enslavement that is primary. And out of that, out of the need to control labor, to have it at a cheap level, to hyper exploit it and to accrue more profits, out of that dynamic comes a need to justify what is being done to those who are doing the labor. And that's where racism is born, because there is the knowledge that these laborers from Africa are human, and that what is being done to them is wrong. And racism steps in to justify the wrong that is done that these slaveholders know is wrong. But racism enables a dehumanization process of Africans to occur that enables the economic character of slavery to continue and to be unchallenged, okay? And this, because of how large the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade was, this slave trade is commonly considered the international slave trade, and it has international effects on racism in the modern era. Okay, so now we're getting closer to the answer to our question. We're trying to understand what is unique about racism in the modern era in order to answer this question, this larger question about the relationship between anti-Black racism and slavery in the modern Indian Ocean. So first of all, when we think about modern racism, we cannot separate it from the influence of the transatlantic slave trade and the images of that trade that circulate. These are images of the degradation of the African, okay? And by the way, these images continue to circulate even after the abolition of the slave trade and slavery. That is to say that the end of slavery does not mean the end of racism. So that even though the system of modern slavery born in the Atlantic is formally abolished almost everywhere by the end of the 19th century, the burdens of color arising thereof on political, on socioeconomic, and on psychological fronts continue to influence public policy and private behavior. And we can see this if we think about what's going on at the end of the 19th century. What else is happening? European imperialism, phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire. The British had conquered India at the end of the 18th century. And at the end of the 19th century, they conquer and occupy Africa. And the distinguishing feature of European colonial rule is the globalization of European and American ideas about race, the so-called color line. It goes to South Africa, it goes to Kenya, it goes to India. Everywhere there is a colonial presence, you see the notion of a color bar. And the fundamental distinction of that color bar is between what are called the darker races of the world, which would include Africans and Indians, and Asians, most everyone in the Indian Ocean world, and Europeans. So the distinction is between those who are European and therefore considered civilized, and those who are non-European and therefore considered uncivilized. And this is where you see an emerging nexus between anti-Black racism, anti-Black racism and the idea of being uncivilized, right? The idea of having some kind of civilizational lack, right? And this is one of the justifications for colonialism. It is said that colonialism is meant to bring these other peoples in the Indian Ocean world into civilization, okay? In anti-Black racism in particular, dark skin and African features are associated by others with negative stereotypes. We can discuss this in many different dimensions, and I'll talk about it a little bit in the next slide, but let's just talk about it with respect to what happened to those Abyssinians who were serving the elites of the Deccan, right? What happened to them? They didn't return to Ethiopia, but what in fact happened to them is that under colonial rule, they lose their link many times to elites and the privileges associated with it. They are regarded by others in South Asian society as being outside the caste system, and existing notions and prejudices against Black skin color are amplified by colonial rule, so that there comes to be a kind of nexus, a kind of association, a mental association between whiteness or lightness and civilization, okay? And so Black people and those with darker skin more generally suffer disproportionately in this, in the midst of these transformations wrought by European colonialism and the European color bar in the aftermath of slavery. Now, I want to talk about, this is maybe a little bit more provocative, some common aspects of race and caste discrimination shared between American and Indian society. And I hope that this generates some discussion. First and foremost, ethnocentrism. The idea that my culture is superior and others are inferior, okay? Ethnocentrism has many complicated aspects, but the one that I want to point to here, the commonality that it shares with the colonial idea of European civilization being superior to all other civilizations on the globe, right? Fear of the other as polluting or degrading to the self, xenophobia, okay? Structural inequality, people who lack access to land, education, employment, and the other things that we might call components of the good life, components that would allow people to find a way out of their low social position, okay? Almost a permanent immobility. And then even though caste is not really based on skin color, we can talk about fairness or whiteness as a beauty ideal, right? Self-image, and the way that this affects social relations and racial prejudices. Okay, and then finally, and then I'll throw it open for some questions. This is a letter that I found from B.R. Ambedkar, who needs no introduction to you all, to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the great sociologists of the 20th century, who wrote extensively about race in the United States and race globally, and was very much interested in the placing the problem of Black people in America in an international context. And so here is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar writing to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Although I have not met you personally, I know you by name, as everyone does who is working in the cause of securing liberty to the oppressed people. I belong to the untouchables of India, and perhaps you might have heard my name. I have been a student of the Negro problem and have read your writings throughout. There is so much similarity between the position of the untouchables in India and of the position of the Negroes in America that the study of the latter is not only natural, but necessary. I was very much interested to read that the Negroes of America have filed a petition to the UNO. The untouchables of India are also thinking of following suit. Will you be so good as to secure for me 2 or 3 copies of this representation by the Negroes and send them to my address? I need hardly say how very grateful I shall be for your troubles in this behalf. And that concludes my presentation. And I thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mathews, for that very rich and eloquent presentation that did not at all sacrifice complexity. And it was, I think, very thought-provoking. And I personally just can't wait to hear what our colleagues in Bangalore might have to say, or questions that they might have to ask in response to the presentation you've delivered. So we're going to ask that questions be posed using the Q&A function, which all of you should have access to. And if it's okay with you, Professor Mathews, I will moderate those questions. And I will say that although I think we'll have an opportunity to address any questions that there may be, I will try to give some space to, again, our colleagues at Christ University to be able to ask questions first and to be able to engage with you. And I am also going to pause pause the recording now because I think it's a good thing to just allow our questions to flow smoothly.